3 twisted tales of obsession, lurking shadows, and relentless pursuit. Tonight, we're diving into the terrifying world of stalkers. Prepare yourself for heart-pounding encounters and sleepless nights as we unravel these chilling stories of those who just wouldn't let go. I remember the first time I saw him. It was just after sunset, a little past 7 in the evening, and I was driving home from work on the single-lane highway that connects the two towns. I have to work in the next town over, about 15 miles away, so it's a decent drive, especially after a long day. I was halfway home when my headlights caught something on the side of the road, a bright flash of color that made me slow down. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light or some weird reflection, but as I got closer, I realized it was a clown. He was wearing the full getup, big red shoes, oversized pants with suspenders, and the kind of face paint you'd see at a kid's party if the theme were nightmares instead of balloon animals. He didn't move. He just stood there, turning his head to follow the beam of my headlights, that painted face grinning. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. At the time, I told myself, it's Halloween season, except it wasn't. We were in the middle of spring, yet I reasoned maybe some bored teenager was playing a prank. But the next day, he was there again. Same time, same side of the road, that stare locked onto my car as I passed. He seemed even closer to the edge, almost like he was waiting for me. The first night, I'd shrugged it off as a weird one-time occurrence. The second time, I felt a chill that settled in the pit of my stomach. His eyes, though partially covered by white face paint, seemed to follow me intently, never blinking, never looking away. By the third and fourth time, I found it difficult to explain to anyone. My co-worker, Lisa, noticed I was anxious. I tried to laugh it off, saying, "There's a clown who stands on the side of the road near my house. Isn't that bizarre?" She thought it was some social media fad, like those clown sightings that sometimes happen as pranks. But when I told her about how I felt, watched, targeted, her smile faded. She suggested I call the police or at least file a report. I felt a bit foolish, but each time I saw him, I became more convinced there was something sinister in that painted smile. So I called the police. They checked the area the next morning, the next afternoon, even parked a squad car in one of the pullouts. But they never found anything. No footprints, no suspicious vehicles, not a trace. When I insisted, "But he's there every evening around 7:30, they nodded politely and said they'd look into it. I could tell they thought I was imagining things. Each day that passed, I saw him again and again. It was never a fleeting glimpse. He was always very clearly there, as though waiting for me. And each time, he stood maybe a mile or so closer to my house. On Monday, he was near the old gas station about 12 miles out. By Tuesday, I spotted him by the abandoned diner about 9 miles out. When Thursday came, I nearly swerved off the road because he was standing at the edge of the farmland, just 3 miles from my neighborhood. Always the same costume, the same grin, the same unwavering stare. My nerves were shot. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I found myself driving faster and faster to get past him, but I couldn't escape that feeling of dread. I started taking different routes, leaving work earlier, or staying late to dodge him. Yet no matter what, there he would be. It was as though he knew my schedule perfectly. Finally, one weekend, after another unsuccessful visit from the police, I decided I would buy a gun. I'd never owned one in my life. I always thought having a gun would make me feel uncomfortable. But given the circumstances, this silent terror following me. It seemed like my only option. The day I bought it, I felt both apprehension and relief. I kept it in a locked case next to my nightstand, thinking that if he tried anything, at least I wouldn't be defenseless. Strangely enough, after I purchased the gun, I stopped seeing him. For 2 days, the roadside was empty. No colorful silhouette, no eerie grin. I almost convinced myself he'd been scared off by the police presence or some stroke of luck that had him bored of terrorizing me. I felt my anxiety slowly start to ease. For the first time in weeks, I slept a full 8 hours without waking up every couple of minutes, peeking out the window to see if someone stood under the street lamp. On the third night, I crawled into bed around 10. I made sure to lock all my doors and windows. Something told me to keep my phone close, so I put it on the nightstand next to the locked gun case. Exhaustion overcame me quickly, and I drifted off to sleep. It must have been a few hours later when something woke me. I couldn't place it at first, maybe a rustling, or the sense of a presence in the room. I rubbed my eyes, disoriented. My heart began to pound in my chest as my vision adjusted to the darkness. And then I saw him, right there, inches away from my face. That same white paint glowed in the dim light of the moon, the red grin contorted in the darkness, and the smell of cheap grease paint was overwhelming. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I gasped, reaching desperately for the gun case, but he was faster. Before I could even swing my arm, a flash of cold metal caught my eye. A blade. The clown's heavy breath filled my ears, and I felt a sharp, agonizing pain in my abdomen. A hot rush of blood seeped through my nightshirt. He pressed his painted face closer, that grin now warped into a horrifying snarl. My vision swam, and I tried to fight him off, but he stabbed me again. The pain was blinding. I heard the clang of the gun case tumbling off the nightstand as my hands flailed. My strength was draining away with each ragged breath. He didn't say a word, not one single word, just a low hiss of breath, and that grotesque grin looming over me. My head spun. I couldn't scream, couldn't get to my phone, couldn't even push him away effectively. My limbs felt like lead. The last thing I remember is the clown's hand on my face, smearing that white paint across my cheek as he pulled away from one of the final stabs. I choked on my own blood, my vision fading to black. The clown was the last thing I saw, those painted eyes shining with malevolence. In that final moment, I thought, I should have told the police to stay here all night. But it was too late. Everything went dark, and all I could think was that horrifying grin was the last thing I'd ever see, ever. I've been playing music for as long as I can remember. Growing up, it was the one thing that brought me peace when everything else seemed chaotic. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was booking small gigs around the region, traveling with a tiny crew and a secondhand tour bus that I managed to lease with my savings. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and I was living my dream, meeting fans, performing live, and putting my heart into every song. The first time I noticed him was at a show in a modest venue, one of those older clubs where the sound system squeaks if you crank it too high. The crowd was lively, but as I sang my second set, I felt a pair of eyes fixated on me. It's not unusual to lock eyes with a fan, especially someone in the front row, but this was different. He stood stone still. He never swayed to the music or blinked. His stare was unsettling, unwavering. After the show, I greeted fans as I always do, signing CDs, snapping pictures, sharing a few laughs. He stood at the edge of the group, just watching, never speaking. When everyone else was gone, he drifted closer, eyes still locked on me. Something inside me twisted with unease. I muttered a quick hello, but he just blinked, nodded, and walked away. It was the strangest encounter I'd had, but I figured maybe he was shy or socially awkward. He showed up at the next gig too, and then the one after that. Always there, always silent, always in the same spot, near the front. After a couple more shows, I decided I would try to talk to him, maybe break the ice. I walked up to him after my set and introduced myself, though my name was on every poster. His eyes lit up as if I'd confirmed some secret understanding. He smiled in a way that made my skin prickle. "Hi," I said cautiously. "I see you at a lot of my shows. I hope you're enjoying the music." He nodded vigorously. Yes, I love you." I swallowed. "I appreciate the support," I managed, forcing a small smile. It was a short interaction, but the moment I left, I regretted it. He began following me around the venues even more closely, as if my friendly word had been a key that unlocked his obsession. He'd stare at me the entire time, and if any other fan came up for a photo or a hug, he would glare at them with palpable anger. At one show, a girl who'd been my fan for years ran up to give me a hug. He stepped forward, aggressive, like he was ready for a fight. I quickly separated them, telling the girl to step back and telling him to relax. My nerves were fried. After the show, I confronted him. "Look," I said, trying to sound firm but polite. "I appreciate you coming out and enjoying my music, but this is not appropriate. You can't go around fighting my fans. If you respect me, you'll stop this right now." His face fell, and he looked at me like I'd just shattered his world. "But I thought No," I cut him off. "We aren't anything. I don't know you. Please leave me alone." He left in tears, muttering something I couldn't quite catch. I thought maybe that was it, that he'd disappear. But for the next few shows, I was anxious, scanning the crowd for any sign of him. Yet he didn't appear. Days turned into 2 weeks. I began to think that maybe he'd finally taken the hint or sought help. My manager suggested hiring a security guard for the bus and the backstage area, but finances were tight. I figured that if he wasn't showing up anymore, maybe the threat had passed. I was wrong. One evening, after a particularly exhausting performance, I made my way back to the tour bus alone. My small crew had gone into the venue's office to settle payments, and I wanted a moment of peace. The lights inside the bus were off, which was normal, but as I climbed the steps, I noticed something was off. The driver, a friendly older man named Rick, usually greeted me if he was inside. Tonight, there was only silence. I flicked on the interior light and nearly screamed. Rick was tied up in the driver's seat, unconscious or barely awake, with blood smeared across his temple. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled backward. I wanted to run, but my instincts told me to see if Rick was still alive. I rushed over, trying not to vomit at the sight of the blood. His pulse was weak but present. That's when I heard a noise from the back of the bus. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a metal flashlight, and crept forward, adrenaline roaring through my veins. The hallway to the sleeping area seemed to stretch on forever. My hands trembled. Another faint sound, a ragged sort of breathing, reached my ears. I pushed the door open, and there he was, my obsessed fan. He lay on my bed, pale, motionless. Blood covered the sheets dripping from his wrists, which he had slashed deeply. Next to his lifeless form was a note, scrawled in a messy, desperate hand. Maybe in the next life. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had never seen a body like that in person, never smelled that copper tang of fresh blood in such quantity. My throat clenched. I stumbled back out into the hall, tears burning my eyes, panic pounding in my head. I managed to get out of the bus and yell for help. My crew came running, and someone called the police. The paramedics arrived, and I pointed them in Rick's direction first. They rushed him to the hospital. Meanwhile, The police carefully sealed off the bus, asking me a flurry of questions. I tried to explain, but it all seemed so surreal. My obsessed fan had broken into the bus, assaulted my driver, and then killed himself in my bed. The note haunted me for days, maybe in the next life, as if he believed fate had destined us to be together, and if it couldn't happen in this life, he'd try for the next. I felt sick, guilty even, like maybe my rejection had driven him over the edge. But I also felt a strange sense of relief that he couldn't hurt anyone else, or me, ever again. I took a break from touring after that. I had to. The nightmares didn't stop for a long while. I'd see him in the front row of my dreams, just staring, unwavering. Over and over I'd see that note, written in his own blood. Sometimes I'd wake up screaming, my heart racing, convinced he was still there. But he wasn't. Now, every time I step on stage, I glance at the crowd and feel a ripple of dread. I wonder if there's another quiet figure in the audience, eyes full of obsession, waiting for a chance to carve their way into my life. I keep performing because music is all I know, but the innocence of sharing my passion with fans will never feel the same. I'd lived in my small suburban neighborhood for about 5 years when she moved in across the street. Our community is usually close-knit. Block parties, barbecues, everyone looking out for everyone. But this new neighbor was different. She was quiet, reclusive. She rarely came out except for the occasional grocery run. We'd see her in passing, but she never made eye contact or waved. One morning, I was out watering my lawn when she stepped outside to check her mailbox. She looked tense, constantly glancing around as if she expected someone to jump out at her. I caught a glimpse of scars on her arm and neck. They looked deep, old, but unmistakable. A pang of concern tugged at me. I thought maybe she'd been in an accident, or perhaps something far worse, like an abusive relationship. I wanted to be friendly, but I also didn't want to intrude. I mustered a smile and waved. "Hey there, I'm your neighbor, just across the street." She paused, then gave a small nod. "Hi," she mumbled. I approached slowly, not wanting to spook her. "Need any help with anything? Moving in? The folks around here are pretty helpful." She shook her head, eyes darting around, and replied, I don't really like talking. I'm sorry." And with that, she hurried back inside. I felt awkward, but also a surge of empathy. Her fear seemed palpable. A few nights later, I was locking up my house when I noticed a car driving slowly through the neighborhood. It was a beat-up sedan, and I'd never seen it before. It circled the block once, headlights low, then passed by again. Something about the way it moved made the hairs on my neck stand up. I went to my window and watched as the car stopped near her house. The driver was a man I didn't recognize. He seemed to be peering through her windows. Alarmed, I called the police immediately. Within minutes, a squad car arrived. The officers questioned the man, and I stepped outside to see what was happening. He was talking smoothly, explaining he was lost, had taken a wrong turn, apologized for the confusion. The police seemed satisfied with his story and escorted him out of the neighborhood. But as he drove off, he glanced over at me with a look that made my stomach clench. It wasn't anger or fear, it was more like smug recognition. While this was happening, I caught sight of my new neighbor peeking out from behind her curtains. She looked terrified, her cheeks streaked with tears. She locked eyes with me for a split second before closing the curtain. In that fleeting moment, I saw a heartbreak of fear and desperation. I had a strong feeling that the man in the car was connected to whatever had caused her scars. The next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of her face, so I decided to check in on her. I knocked on her door gently. There was a long pause before she finally opened it just a crack, chain still on. "What is it?" she asked, voice trembling. "I just wanted to see if you're okay," I said softly. "That car last night. It seemed suspicious. The police let him go, but I'm worried. Is there anything you need? This is a pretty friendly block, and we watch out for each other." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too late. He found me. He saw me. I have to leave." I glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. "Listen, you don't have to run. We can help you. Stay in my house tonight if you're afraid. Or we can have some neighbors keep watch. It's safe here, I promise." Her eyes were filled with tears. I thought for sure she'd refuse, but after a long moment, she nodded. "Okay, for one night." That evening, a few of our neighbors and I gathered at my place. We took shifts watching her house across the street, scanning for any sign of that car or its driver. Around midnight, headlights appeared. It was the same battered sedan, creeping down the road with its lights off. My heart pounded. We watched as the man got out, a hood pulled over his face, and slipped around to the back of her house. Immediately, we called the police again. A couple of neighbors wanted to confront him right away, but I insisted we wait until the police arrived. However, when we saw him force a window open and climb into her house, adrenaline took over. Me and two neighbors sprinted across the street. We heard him rummaging inside, and then a crash of breaking glass. We burst in through the front door, shouting for him to stop. He turned, wild-eyed, brandishing a gun. My stomach lurched. He pointed it at us, screaming something incoherent. We dove behind furniture, desperate for cover. The sirens grew louder, and within moments, a squad car screeched to a halt outside. 2 officers entered with their weapons drawn. A chaotic shootout ensued. Glass shattered. Someone yelled. I flattened myself against the floor, hands over my head. Shots echoed through the house, each one sending a jolt of terror through me. Finally, everything went quiet. I dared to look up and saw the man slumped against the wall, bleeding. The officers rushed forward, checked for a pulse, but it was clear. He was gone. Shaken, I stepped outside into the cool night air. My new neighbor was standing on my porch across the street, a few other neighbors comforting her. When she saw me, relief spread across her face, followed by a surge of tears. She ran over and wrapped her arms around me, sobbing, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I just held her, my heart hammering. The reality of what had just happened sunk in. We had saved her life, and possibly our own. Later that night, when the medics and police finished up, she told me a bit of her story. That the man had been an abusive ex who swore he'd find her. She'd fled from across the country to escape him, never believing he'd track her down. In the days that followed, our neighborhood rallied around her. We helped repair her broken window, and everyone made it clear she wasn't alone anymore. Though she was still shaky and jumpy, she expressed such gratitude that it broke my heart. "I never knew people could be so kind," she told me, tears in her eyes. Now she's slowly settling in, no longer afraid to step outside. She even attended our next block barbecue, timidly at first, but smiling whenever she was greeted warmly. The scars on her arms and neck remain, a visible reminder of her past. But I'd like to think we helped her heal a little, by showing her what real community looks like. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness, and a neighborhood willing to stand together, to give someone the courage to stop running and start living again.